I'd like to welcome Lee Humber, who is a lecturer at Oxford Brookes University. Lee has had a long-standing interest in the employment and social inclusion of people with learning disabilities. He's had a number of roles as a researcher, a supporter of research carried out by young people with learning difficulties, as a disability service manager in a local authority social services department not too far from here, as a special educational needs classroom teacher, and he's also edited a number of books on specific disability issues.
Okay, well thanks a lot for... That's on, is it, Dory?
Yeah.
Right. Thanks a lot for inviting me. So the title of my presentation today is Social Inclusion and Employment, the Marketisation of Employment Support for People with Learning Disabilities. Apologies about the crudity of that phrase, that word marketisation, but I couldn't come up with anything that was more sort of succinct. Okay, introduction. So first of all, my research. I did my dissertation at my PhD at the Open University, and what I did was I worked with something like nearly 50 people with learning disabilities, mostly young people, well, not mostly young people, mostly people at further education colleges and various training courses, and some people who were attending day centres. About 50 of those people, and then about another 20 or so service providers. And the borough that Doria was referring to is just down the road, Camden. So I worked for many years in Camden, and then I went and did my research there, basically drawing on lots of the contacts that I've made during the time of my employ there. I looked at employment and employment support for people with learning disabilities from World War II onwards. So I was able to interview people from every decade following World War II. So I think the oldest interviewee was 74. That was the sort of time frame that I looked at specifically, but of course in order to inform that and prepare myself for that period of research, I looked much further back, and so I've done a certain amount of research into the historical roots of something called learning disability, or as it was previously known, mental handicap, or as it was known before that, mental deficiency. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but not much. Secondly, importantly, terms. People who are familiar with the learning disability world will know that there are all sorts of terms that refer to largely the same thing. So the term that I'm going to be using today is learning disability. I'm talking specifically, and my research focused specifically on people who are known as people with mild and moderate learning disabilities. Okay, there is another category of people with learning disabilities called severe and complex, and those are people who are non-verbal communicators, lots of wheelchair users, and so on and so forth. For all sorts of reasons, I didn't research those people. I looked at people with mild and moderate learning disabilities, which actually make up something like 80% of the whole category of people with learning disabilities. Again, if you're familiar with learning disabilities, you'll know that the numbers of people with learning disabilities it's not known accurately. There are estimates of that say there are something like between 1 million and 1.5 million people with learning disabilities in the UK. So I looked at people with mild and moderate learning disabilities. Other terms, people in the people might know of a People First movement. That is a movement driven forward by people with learning disabilities. They like to refer to themselves as people with learning difficulties. Then there are other lots of people in the educational world talk about specific learning difficulties, and those are things like dyslexia and dyspraxia and so on. I'm going to use the term learning disabilities. Okay. Okay, briefly on the sort of background to my study. 1913 is a key year because that was the year of what was known as the Mental Deficiency Act, and from that point on there was something called, officially, something called mental deficiency. Not only that, there were policy and legal frameworks that dealt with people who were designated as having mental deficiencies, and very swiftly after that, institutions to cater for what people in the disability world call care and control people with learning disabilities. Those institutions started to to be developed. A central thing right from the very beginning, the central consideration in terms of designating somebody as somebody with mental deficiency was the idea that they were unemployable. So you look back at all the sort of early understandings of something called mental deficiency, and the idea that that person could not support themselves through employment was absolutely central. So from 1913 onwards, and before that sort of unofficially, but certainly from 1913 onwards, the idea that if you couldn't support yourself through employment, then you were that was one way of showing that you had a mental deficiency. So lots of the sort of services that were developed for people with learning disabilities subsequently, following 1913, involved different bits of work in different bits of employment. However, it was seen as something that basically occupied time. The work that was done by people with learning disabilities was given no sort of value. People with learning disabilities from 1913 onwards were regarded as a social burden. Because they couldn't support themselves through employment, they were considered a social burden. And that would have an effect on the employment potential and possibility of their parents and carers. Because if parents and carers were looking after people with learning disabilities, then they couldn't get jobs either, or get very part-time jobs. Hence the development of institutions. So it was argued through various bits of legislation, I've not got time to go through it all, but various bits of legislation said we need institutions to take away these people with learning disabilities, children, young people with learning disabilities from their parents, so that they can go out and get jobs. Okay? So central to assessment of mental deficiency was the idea that people themselves were unemployable and that they were some kind of social burden. And just very briefly, both of these ideas are completely untrue. History shows that throughout, people with learning disabilities have worked. So in institutions themselves, there was, forgive the language, but lots of this language is quite offensive, but legislation in the 1930s advised institutions to make sure they had a sufficient number of what they called high grades. People, basically people with mild and moderate learning disabilities. Institutions were required to have enough of these people within the institutions so that those people could do the work in the institutions. Cleaning, cooking, looking after what were known as low grades, in other words, people with severe and complex. So within institutions, people with learning disabilities have always worked. But not only that, out in the community, there is lots of evidence that show that people with learning disabilities have worked also, throughout. Lots of it's anecdotal, some of it makes its way into historical records, especially around world wars. Not quite so much World War I, but certainly World War II. In World War II, during World War II, institutions for people with learning disabilities virtually emptied, because people with learning disabilities moved out and got jobs in the community or joined the army. So there is a corps in the army, both First World War and Second World War, called the Pioneer Corps. It's basically an unarmed corps that went and dug trenches and built walls and did all that sort of thing. And it went all over the various theatres of war during World War II. People with learning disabilities were included in that pioneer company. We know this, records show that. So they contributed to World War II. Whatever you think about that. Not only that, there are records to show that they had work in local communities. I recently was doing some research to support a research funding bid, and found records of people with learning disabilities working as drivers' mates. I know we found these records because there was a series of complaints between the companies of these employing these people and the War Office. And basically companies were saying, do we have to pay these people with learning disabilities the same rates as non-disabled drivers' mates? And the War Office said, no, you don't. You can pay them less. So we know that through those records. So lots and lots of evidence that people with learning disabilities have always worked. So this idea that they're unemployable is a complete nonsense. However, it has stuck like glue to people with learning disabilities. If you've got learning disabilities, that means you can't work. Okay, this idea began to change in certain respects, and I'll talk about the details of that as we go through, so I don't waffle on too much. Began to change in the sort of early 1980s, and I'll talk about this in the sections in more detail. But 1984 is a kind of a key year because there was a publication of by the King's organisation's name I can't remember. King's Fund, exactly. Called An Ordinary Working Life. In 1984, they published something called An Ordinary Working Life, which I think was 3 years after a publication of theirs called An Ordinary Life. And in Ordinary Working Life, the King's Fund basically critiqued how employment support was being delivered to people with learning disabilities to that point, and suggested new ways of doing that. So a kind of a key point. And from that moment on, employment has become seen as important up until the end of the previous Labour Party, absolutely central to social inclusion. And I'll talk about that as we go through. Okay, so history, policy, experience and some conclusions. So those basically are the 4 sections of my talk today. And as I say, the history won't be, don't worry, I won't waffle on about 1913 onwards. It should be after the World War II. Okay, history. ATCs, I don't know whether people have heard of these. These are adult training centres. From after World War II up until they sort of dwindled away from the mid-1980s onwards. Adult training centres were the way that employment training and employment support was offered to people with learning disabilities. I did my research was on there were 2 in Camden basically. The final one out in Greenwood Place, out in past King's Cross. Basically, it was a big building usually, and it had all sorts of trades there. So there was a printing trade there that people could get trained on. There was lots of sort of packing jobs, so that stuff would come in and people would pack them in boxes and send them out again. At the one in Greenwood Place, there was a laundrette developed later on. So a whole kind of number of training opportunities for people with learning disabilities, and my research showed that there were all sorts of experiences of this. You know, some people experienced this as fantastically supportive, and people got together with a group of friends on a daily basis and got paid a very small wage for doing the work that they were doing. Had a good time and then went home. Basically, they found it supportive. Others found it incredibly stultifying. In fact, really limiting, people taking control of their lives and them not being given opportunities to develop in any way, shape or form. So, varying experiences of adult training centres. What we can say for certain is the extent to which adult training centres folded over into work in the mainstream was very, very limited indeed. Tiny, something like 2% on average over the 20 years or so of their existence of people moved from adult training centres into some kind of mainstream employment. So you can say that for 98% of people who attended ATCs, that was it in terms of employment. They were there for the rest of their working life, basically, or at least for the next 20 years or so, until they all started to close down. Now, importantly, there's any number of things, and I obviously haven't got time to go on about ATCs at any great length, but it's important to recognise that ATCs were both a segregated provision, in that people employed in there were all people with learning disabilities, but also had an impact on employment elsewhere. So, for example, I talked about the laundrette at Greenwood Place. The laundrette employed people and paid people at a very, very low wage way below the wage of the market rate outside. If somebody had been able to get a job in a laundrette outside, then they would have been paid more. However, the local authority used that laundrette to wash loads of their clothes. You know, they sent their overalls there and all that sort of stuff. So the local authority were benefiting massively because it cut their costs majorly. And in this way, that sort of employment in there impacted on employment elsewhere. Because if you're a laundrette outside the ATC and you wanted local authority business, then you'd have to pay your workers' wages the same as the workers' wages in the ATC. Do you see that? So it is segregated physically, but economically and socially, to a certain extent, it's linked in with mainstream employment. It's an important point to make. Okay, I talked a little bit about an ordinary working life. In 1984, this document appeared by the King's Fund, and it was a thorough critique of ATCs and made some extremely good points. The sort of main bit that main sort of element of ATCs that it critiqued was the idea of the idea that ATCs had of training to place. So the ATC said that we will train you here, and then we will, once you're skilled enough, we'll place you in employment outside at proper wages. That, as I've said, that didn't happen at all. Or 2% of people, something, managed to get placed that way. So that whole idea, the train to place thing, was rubbished by the ordinary working life document. In its place, they suggested something called situational support, which is now that's basically the model that is now been taken up and is used to this day. Supported employment in open employment. So the training and the job happens on the job, and you are, as I'll talk about later, you're supervised and supported by various agencies. Okay, so ATCs. If you look at documents sort of early 70s and mid 70s describing the adult training centres, then these documents foresee a massive expansion in ATCs. Enoch Powell, for example, that paragon of liberalism, Enoch Powell talks about an expansion of ATCs to cater for people with learning disabilities and other disabilities, sees it as central as a way of providing social care in the community, but also, very importantly, central to catering for the people who would be moving out of long-stay institutions. Because in the backdrop of this, from the kind of early 70s onwards, was a realisation that long-stay institutions were not providing the care that was required. And people might be familiar with, there are endless reports of the disgraceful conditions of long-stay institutions. People with whole wards having their teeth cleaned with the same toothbrush, and people sharing the same bath over and over again. Disgraceful stuff, which we haven't got time to go into. But anyway, so Enoch Powell, who was at that time, he's got some kind of name, something like the father of the closure of long-stay institutions or something. Because he was very concerned with closing down long-stay institutions. He saw ATCs as a kind of community-based replacement. This was continued. That opinion was accepted by the Labour Party generally. They were behind a kind of seminal report in the early 70s, Better Services for People with Mental Handicap, which again described ATCs as the way forward. This all came to a crashing end from the early 1980s onwards. 84, An Ordinary Working Life provided, if you like, the sort of ideological framework for a critique of ATCs. But what really drove the closure of ATCs was this next reference, mixed economies, which is code for care in the community. So that whole kind of, from the early 80s onwards, the whole sort of movement to something called care in the community was actually the backdrop to the closure of ATCs. It was actually the backdrop to the change in opinion in how we provide employment support for people with learning disabilities. Okay? So it's actually quite relevant that we're talking about care in the community at the minute, given that it's one of its chief architects is just popped her clogs. Okay, so the mixed economies, Camden development. So I was going to talk a little bit about what that meant locally. Locally, that meant that a local authority provision, Greenwood Place, was taken over and run by voluntary sector organisations, in particular one voluntary sector organisations. So the whole sort of movement away from local authority being a provider to local authority being commissioner and buyer, purchaser of social care began during this period and provides the backdrop to a change from the train to place of ATCs to the situational support, the supported employment that followed. And there are various ways of sort of capturing this movement. Certainly locally it meant that buildings were taken over, services were taken over by the voluntary sector. And I've got a few figures. Between 2001 and 2004, there was something like a 62% increase in local authority and government spending on the voluntary sector. In other words, both local and central government saw the necessity of developing and reinforcing voluntary sector organisations, voluntary sector services as a way of replacing the services that previously they had provided. Okay, so just to finish on currently how supported employment is provided and funded today, we've got something called a prime contractor model. What happens is, once every so often, or certainly under the Labour government, we're not sure what's going to happen under the current administration. Every so often, a call for bids is put out to voluntary sector organisations in terms of supported employment, millions and millions of pounds. Various organisations bid for that, and on the basis of how well they can provide that, how cheaply, what their record is in the past, how well they know the language that is required, the contracts are awarded to these people. So the leader in this section of the market, if you like, is currently the Shaw Trust. The last prime contractor call went out in 2010. There was something like 28 different contracts offered, and the Shaw Trust got 16 of them. So the Shaw Trust has got a reputation and a history of providing this supported employment, and they tend to get the sort of lion's share of it. What happens then is the prime contractor will strike a contract with subcontractors. So the Shaw Trust might be operating from, let's say, London. They haven't got anybody in all of the boroughs in London, so they enlist the help of subcontractors in local authorities. So a voluntary sector organisation in Camden, for example, is a subcontractor of Shaw Trust contracts. The prime contractor model has been massively critiqued by all sorts of people, by the British Association of Supported Employment, who oversee employment support for disabled people generally, by service users, by service providers, by within government itself. It's regarded as wasteful. A piece of research recently done by Plymouth University showed that the majority of money spent in after winning prime contractor contracts is spent on managing resources rather than providing employment opportunities for people with learning disabilities and so on. So lots of it goes on admin, management, all that sort of layer. And then, of course, if you've got prime contractor, subcontractor, then service user, then at each layer, a bit of money leaks out. So what we've seen is that, again, I'll talk about it a bit more in detail. What we've seen is that the prime contractor model has not been efficient in increasing the employment rates over the past 20 years over which it's operated. The model has been criticised for what's called creaming or parking service users. So, if in terms of creaming, what happens is the individuals who are most likely to get a job and retain a job are chosen to be supported into employment, because then that looks well on the figures and is likely to give the Shaw Trust or whoever else more chance of getting funds in the future. If you've had 10 people in supported employment for a year, that's going to look better than if you've had one person in employment for a year. So you get a creaming of the best sort of candidates. Otherwise, the opposite of that is parking. So the more difficult people to place get sort of held to one side and don't get the employment support that they need. Okay, so that's a brief jog through of the history of employment support and how it has moved from a public authority run thing to a voluntary sector run thing currently. Okay, policy. Again, I won't go through every piece of policy. I'll just look at some of the kind of key ones over the past few years. It's important to start a discussion of policy with that first reference, social inclusion discourse, because this has been about the way this move to supported employment, to people being situated in mainstream employment and trained and supported there, has come under the auspices of social inclusion discourse. The social inclusion discourse, which really was pioneered by the Labour Party. It doesn't really exist in any sense before the Labour Party of 1997. From the very beginning, disability activists and disability academics were very worried about talking about this thing in terms of social inclusion. They were worried that the more it got discussed in terms of a social inclusion discourse, the further it moved away from a sort of economic base of disability, which was poverty, basically. The experience of poverty is linked inextricably with the experience of disability, including learning disabilities, in all sorts of complex ways. But so, the policy I'm going to discuss, and the value in people and the other documents can be considered under what is termed a social inclusion discourse. Okay, so people might be familiar with some of these. 2001, a document called Value in People really set an agenda for the social inclusion of people with learning disabilities. Value in People document was consulted with people with learning disabilities and tried to involve them and involve their opinions and experiences. Central to the Value in People document was the issue of rights, the issue of independence, and the issue of choice and inclusion. Also central to Value in People was a personalisation agenda, by which was meant that people should receive targeted and individualised services. In other words, one aspect of a personalisation agenda, and it's got all sorts of strengths and weaknesses, but certainly one central aspect is the idea that it's a move away from a kind of general set of services provided by welfare. So everybody gets the same benefits and stuff. What we're talking about after valuing people is targeted and individualised services. Those included individualised budgets and certainly included individualised targets and packages of employment support. I mentioned on the last slide about the document in 1971, Better Services for Mental Handicapped. That document was very specific about it wanted to improve extend the number of centres that ran employment support, so it put figures on that. He wanted to extend the number of people accessing that, so it put figures on that, from whatever it was, 20,000 up to 60,000 or whatever. One thing about one of the many things that Value in People document has been criticised about is there are no specific targeted outcomes in that sense. It doesn't say at the end of this period we want to have improved the employment support of people by X percent. It's just it establishes the sort of core values, if you like, that stuff about rights, independence, choice. It establishes that without setting any figures. So an academic called Race, who's written extensively over the past few years, talks about valuing people now in terms of what he calls a progress in process. In other words, the document sets out to try and improve the ways that services and employment support is provided for people with learning disabilities without setting any definite targets. Obviously, it's very difficult then to say valuing people has been successful. or valuing people has not been successful because it doesn't reach a particular target, then it can argue that, oh no, we've changed the sort of agenda of learning disabilities, and other people can say, well, no, you're not. So it's very difficult to makes it very difficult to sort of assess its success, really. Okay, the next document, Value and Employment Now, in 2009. Sort of a move on from Value and People 2001. Really, really fascinating document because it is the first document in the history of mental deficiency from 1913 and before that points up the centrality of employment. You think back to my introduction, and unemployability was one of the key markers of having learning disabilities. 2009, now employment and the potential for employment and the need for employment is central to the social inclusion of people with learning disabilities. So the thing is completely changed around in the course of it. So the first ever employment-specific document, it was agreed, it's cross-party agreed. I think the document was written by something like 5 different departments. But again, no specific figures. Again, it's a sort of progressing process. It's, you know, the stuff is, it's all very nice and lovely ideals and very nicely worded and beautifully put together and all that sort of thing, but there are no definite targets. It doesn't say we've had enough now of people being excluded from employment on the basis of learning disabilities. We want to end that by 2020. We want to make sure that 50% of people with learning disabilities have got jobs instead of the current. None of that kind of thing is there. The nearest it comes to sort of definite statements is a phrase, we want to move people nearer to the labour market. Now, that phrase has been heavily critiqued by all sorts of people. So, for example, a bunch of academics from Lancaster University, Grover and Piggott, talk about moving nearer the labour market, people nearer the labour market. Well, that could mean moving people from off of disability allowance onto job seekers allowance. You can still stay on benefits, but you're kind of slightly nearer to the labour market. So there are concerns, and there was it wasn't a great debate actually, but there was a debate about whether people with learning disabilities were becoming part of what's called a reserve army of labour. I won't go into that phrase unless you want to discuss it later. I'm more happy to. But it basically means the project of Value and Employment Now wasn't to get people actually jobs, but to make them potentially more employable for employers looking for more employment. So again, a very sort of, I think somebody over there said it, woolly document that sets no definite targets. And Valuing People Now is the sort of sister document to Value and Employment. It again puts the argument that employment is central to social inclusion agendas. Basically, what Valuing People Now does is set an ideological framework. So Valuing People Now is incredibly useful for organisations like the Shore Trust or other voluntary sector organisations working in this particular area, because it gives them all of the sort of reference points that they will need to reference if they are going to be awarded service provision by central government. So it sets an ideological framework. Unless you kind of, as an organisation, tick the boxes, set down in Valuing People Now, that's going to undermine your success rate in terms of winning funds from central and local government. What Valuing People Now does is certainly accelerate the move away from any kind of notion of universal provision. So it's very hot on personalisation of services, individualism, targeted services, and so on and so forth. And so one of the outcomes of Valuing People Now, or something that has continued apace after following Valuing People Now, is the closure of day centres. The day centres are being closed down, right, left and centre. One of the arguments used to close down day centres, and this is a current argument, I subscribe to various sort of forums and things, and that argument about on this current forum that I'm subscribed to is the value of day centres. Are they just a dinosaur that everybody goes there and what they do is spend the day basket weaving, or is it an opportunity for people to socialise with like-minded people? Is it an opportunity for people to develop friendships? And you kind of valuing people now is very much against day centres on the basis of, no, what we need is targeted, individualised services. Okay, so very briefly, that individualised and targeted services continues apace in terms of employment support. So a while ago, I came to see Liz Sayce. Came and talked, didn't she? She wrote a review called "Getting In, Staying In, and Getting On" about disabled people getting jobs. And one of the government response to the SACE review was to argue that the individualisation of employment support would continue. And the PIPS, people might be familiar with, it stands for Personalised Personal Independence Payments. So they've kind of, in their policy now, they've enshrined this idea that social services should be individualised, targeted, and personalised. And just finally, on this sort of what people think about personalisation and employment support, is again been heavily criticised by virtually everybody apart from the government involved in the project, really. The British Association of Supported Employment talked about it. They said it excludes many disabled job seekers, and how it works. Personalised supported employment budgets are complex to manage and aren't actually wanted by the majority of service users, and that's reflected in other reports from service users themselves. So that's the policy over the last, pretty much 20 years. Pretty much this employment support really got taken seriously from the 1990s onwards. And the upshot of that 20 years of movement to the voluntary sector, targeted services, a raft of policy initiatives, the effect in terms of numbers accessing employment. In 1990, a survey of people with learning disabilities in employment found that something like 7% of everybody with learning disabilities was in some kind of employment that they maintained over a period of time, something like 7%. After 20 years of all this, that figure had fallen to 6.4%. So I think we can sort of begin to suggest that maybe this isn't the way to deal with the exclusion of people with learning disabilities from employment. Okay, what time do we start? Right, I've got about 10 minutes. The experience, and I wanted to, very briefly, because my research was about interviews, basically, so I captured the experiences of people looking for work and people who had been in work. And so I put interviews and subjectivity up there, because the opinions that I captured were subjective opinions. I got their feelings of how they'd been treated at work, what they thought about their aspects, their prospects of work. And I think in that, and there's quite a literature now supporting the idea of and the value of subjectivity. What I got from that, I think, was I begin to get an idea of the socio-cultural barriers that stand in the way of people getting work in the first place and then maintaining work. And I've put two very brief examples of this, just to sort of illustrate this in two extremes. In between these two extremes are all sorts of different layers of this thing, but I thought I'd put the two extremes, really. So one guy I interviewed, Richard, it's not his real name, when you start talking to him, then suddenly you are in shit, sorry about the language. I don't know why, they've all been listening, don't want to talk to me or work with me. So basically he described an experience at work. He got a job through a local authority scheme. This was before it all got sent out to the voluntary sector. And he was basically ostracised by his workmates, sent to Coventry, he uses the phrase later on. And so completely excluded because he didn't fit in for all sorts of reasons. Because his workmates couldn't find ways of establishing a relationship with him. Because he potentially didn't have the sort of appropriate skills to establish relationships with his workmates. Because Richard, like the vast majority of the people that I interviewed, had gone through segregated education at school, segregated college education, segregated employment support in terms of he was at an ATC before he got this job. So the upshot was, for all sorts of reasons, he was ostracised in this particular place of work. So that's one extreme, sort of, if you like, the most crude extreme of being excluded in work. The second one is a bit more complex. So Anna, she said, if I need the time off, they let me have it, but I've always said, say no to me. It's complex in this sense. Because Anna, again, not a name, she worked for, I think when I interviewed her, she'd been working for 7 years in this particular place of employment. She described to me in great detail. I think in an hour and a half interview with her, I think I must have asked about 2 questions. So she taught for England, and she described in great detail the details of what she did at work. She basically worked, really sounded like really hard, and did an ordinary job. Okay, her major bugbear was that she was treated differently to everybody else. In this sense, that if she had to go somewhere or wanted to go somewhere to a meeting, or she sat on various committees of people with learning disabilities, no matter what, her boss would always say, yeah, of course you can. The upshot was, she felt devalued as a worker because of that. She felt like, well, if they just want to get rid of me anytime, then what am I adding to this job? So she felt kind of excluded in that sense, that she wasn't allowed to be an ordinary worker with the limitations on her time that involves for the rest of us. Now, I put down at the bottom there, Naturalised Views. A guy called Dan Goodley and various other learning disability activists talk about naturalised views being the key aspect of problems for people with learning disabilities. There have become, over historical time, a set of views about people with learning disabilities. They're a social burden. They can't do jobs, etc., etc. There are all sorts of ways of viewing people with learning disabilities. And for Goodley, that is the key thing that stands in the way. Importantly, though, it stands in the way on both sides of the agenda. So I talked about Richard. Richard describes himself as somebody with learning disabilities. Anna describes herself as somebody with learning. She says at one point, I'm the only person with learning disabilities in the job. Yet she's been working there for 7 years, now 9 years, doing this incredibly complex job that she described to me. So what is learning disabled about her job? But she describes, she because of her history, she considers herself somebody with learning disabilities. And in that sense, it's a barrier to her making relationships with other people. But also, other people have these sets of naturalised views. So this lot up here just didn't understand and didn't want anything to do and pushed Richard away. This lot here, there's a beautiful phrase that in learning disability, some Sabsay and Platt have come up with, about to describe the way people sort of misunderstand learning disabilities at the other end. It's called well-intentioned condescension. So people, for the best of reasons, try and over-support, if you like, people with learning disabilities. So instead of treating them like anybody else, they treat them as somebody who needs some kind of care. So those two things, if you like, are the two extremes of barriers facing people with learning disabilities. Okay, let me try and bring this to a sort of conclusion. Right, so unemployability. Well, I've described at great length how this sort of thing was at the beginning central to what mental deficiency meant and what learning disabilities meant, the fact that people couldn't get jobs. That was despite the fact that around them, people with learning disabilities consistently got jobs over history. But that this thing turned completely around during the course of the 1980s, and especially from the early 1990s onwards. So from being people who couldn't get jobs, and therefore they were socially excluded, it changed to a point of people who needed to get jobs in order to be socially included. So a massive sort of turnaround in what employment means. Market failures. Well, 20 years. Let's not forget, actually, in the 20 years from 1990 to whenever it was, 2007, there were historically high rates of employment. You know, to a certain extent, from 1997 onwards, we'd never had it so good in terms of rates and employment, and we'd had these specific policies, and we'd had the setting up of voluntary sector organisations whose only aim was to support people into employment, yet the figure for employment support, for employment has dropped. So we can say that the market has, I would say, we could say that the market has failed in that sense. The socio-cultural complexity that I've just described in terms of the two extremes, the well-intentioned condescension and the sort of outright exclusion, the pushing away of people, that is complex. That has been created over 150 years of mental deficiency learning disability. The idea that that can be dealt with piecemeal on an individual by individual basis by companies who want to turn a profit at the end of the day, I think is a complete nonsense. I don't think until we've had a reassessment of what learning disability means and doesn't mean, will we start to address that figure of 7% of people with employment, and therefore will we start to address the issue of people with learning disabilities being excluded from mainstream society. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.